It was my neighbor Patty who first said something, and I almost laughed it off. She caught me at the mailbox on a Wednesday morning, still in her housecoat with a coffee mug in one hand, and she said, "Dorothy, I didn't know you were renting the downstairs out now. There were 2 young men with suitcases in your driveway on Saturday." I waved, but they didn't seem to know who I was. I told her she must have been mistaken. I'd been home on Saturday. I hadn't gone anywhere. She shrugged and said maybe she'd mixed up the days, and we moved on. But I stood at the mailbox a little longer than I needed to, looking at the front of the house, and something in my chest went quiet in a way I didn't like. I've owned that duplex for 31 years. My husband Gerald and I bought it the spring after our son was born, back when the neighborhood was still mostly young families and the oak trees on the block hadn't grown tall enough to meet overhead. We lived in the upper unit for 2 decades, renting out the lower one to help with the mortgage. And then when Nathan was in high school and Gerald's back made the stairs difficult, we switched. We moved downstairs, rented the upper unit out, and that became the rhythm of our lives. When Gerald died 6 years ago, the duplex was the one thing I held on to without question. The other things, the second car, the vacation timeshare, the storage unit full of things I thought I needed, those I let go. But not the house. It was in the deed and in the trust Gerald and I had drawn up together, and both units belonged to me outright. Nathan had been struggling for nearly 2 years when he came to me. He'd lost a steady contract with a firm that had downsized, and freelance design work had never quite replaced it. He was 33, living in a 1-bedroom apartment across town with a lease that was about to expire, and the particular kind of pride that makes a son knock before entering, even when the door is already open. He didn't ask directly. He said he was trying to figure out his options, and I could hear in his voice that he had already run out of them. I told him to take the upper unit. I'd been renting it to a quiet couple from the university, but their lease was ending anyway. Nathan could stay as long as he needed. No rent, no conditions, just family. He moved in on a Sunday in late October, and I helped him carry boxes up the stairs until my knees told me to stop. He seemed lighter after that, more like himself. We had dinner together twice a week, which was more than we'd managed since Gerald passed. For a few months, things felt steady. Then he called me on a Thursday evening and said he'd met someone. Her name was Renee. She was 31, worked in residential real estate, and apparently had an opinion on everything from coffee beans to crown molding. "She's confident," he said, which I'd learned over the years is what people say when they mean someone is difficult but beautiful. I said I'd love to meet her. He said he'd set something up. The first time Renee shook my hand, she did it the way people shake hands at job interviews, firm and brief and slightly too long. She looked around my living room in the way someone in real estate looks at rooms, noting things, calculating. She complimented the original hardwood floors, and then mentioned they were probably original to the 1970s construction, which was technically a compliment, though it didn't feel like one. She asked about the layout of the building, how many square feet each unit was, whether the roof had been updated recently. I answered politely. Nathan watched her with an expression I'd seen before on his father's face, the particular look of a man who has decided a woman is extraordinary and is waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. They moved fast. Within 4 months, Renee had moved her things into the upper unit. Within 6, Nathan told me over dinner that they were engaged. I put my fork down and took a breath and said that was wonderful news. And I meant it, even through the knot in my throat. I asked when they were thinking. He said soon. Renee's idea of a timeline, he explained, was different from most people's. They married in March. Small ceremony. Mostly her family and a handful of Nathan's friends. I sat in the front row and wore the blue dress I'd bought for Gerald's retirement dinner and told myself that the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach was just the unfamiliar shoes. What came after was gradual at first. The way water damage is gradual. You don't notice it until the ceiling starts to bow. Renee began making changes to the upper unit almost immediately, which was her right as someone living there, and I told myself so. New fixtures, new paint, a kitchen backsplash she'd selected herself and had installed by a contractor I'd never met, who charged a price she mentioned only in passing. The backyard, which had always been shared informally between both units, began to acquire Renee's furniture exclusively: a teak sectional, a fire pit, string lights that crisscrossed from the fence to the eave of the garage. When I asked if I might move my garden bench back to the corner where I'd always kept it, she said she'd have to think about how it would look with the aesthetic. I let that go. What I couldn't let go as easily were the conversations I overheard at the housewarming party she hosted in April. I'd been invited, which I took as a good sign, and I stood near the kitchen island with a glass of sparkling water watching Nathan work the room with the easy confidence he'd been missing for years. Renee moved through her guests like she was hosting a showcase. At one point, a woman I didn't recognize asked her if the whole building was theirs, and Renee said yes, both units. They'd been in the family for years. She gestured with her wine glass toward the ceiling. The other woman said she must love having the investment income, and Renee said they were exploring options. She used the word portfolio. I set my glass down on the counter very carefully and went home through the connecting door to my unit and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The following Tuesday, I brought it up over the phone with Nathan, gently, the way I'd learned to bring things up with him, which was to say everything sideways and hope he heard what I actually meant. I said I'd overheard Renee telling guests the building was hers and I wasn't sure what she'd meant. He was quiet for a moment, then said she probably just meant it in the sense of their home, their place. I said I understood, but just to be clear, both units were still in my name, as they always had been. He said, "Of course, Mom." He said it the way people say of course when the conversation has become uncomfortable and they want to move through it quickly. I should have pushed harder. I know that now. 3 weeks later, I took a trip to visit my sister in Phoenix. She'd had a hip replacement and needed some help for a few weeks, and I was happy to go. I told Nathan I'd be gone until the second week of June. He said fine, no problem. He'd keep an eye on things. I left a spare key with Patty next door, the way I always did, and drove to the airport with a light feeling in my chest that I didn't know would be the last easy feeling for a while. It was Patty's message that broke it open. She texted me on a Friday night, the third week I was in Phoenix, with a photo attached. It showed my front door, the door to my unit, and beside it a small lockbox mounted to the frame, the kind vacation rental guests use to retrieve keys. "Did you start renting?" her text said. "There's been different people going in and out every few days." I didn't want to say anything, but it's been 3 weeks now. I sat in my sister's spare bedroom for a very long time looking at that photo. I opened my laptop and searched my address on every short-term rental platform I could think of. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. My unit, my home, listed on 2 separate sites, hosted by an account with no photo and a name I didn't recognize, which turned out, when I searched it alongside Renee's name, to be her maiden name. Cheerful, staged photos I'd never taken of my own kitchen, my own living room, the bathroom. I'd retiled myself 12 years ago. The listing said the unit was perfect for couples and small groups, offered a full kitchen and private entrance, and had received 14 5-star reviews in 8 weeks. The going rate was $189 per night on weekdays, $225 on weekends. I did the math. I had been gone 43 days. I called Nathan that night. He didn't answer. I called again in the morning. When he finally picked up, I told him what I had found, calmly, in the measured voice I had perfected over 30 years of night shifts dealing with difficult situations. There was a silence that lasted too long. Then he said he had known about it. He said Renee had suggested it as a way to generate income on a vacant unit, that he had assumed since the building was more or less his to manage while I was away, it had seemed harmless. That word, harmless, sat in the air between us like something spoiled. I asked him where the money had gone. He said Renee had handled it. I flew home 2 days earlier than planned. When I pulled into the driveway, Renee was at the upper window. She watched me get out of the car and retrieve my bag from the trunk without coming down or opening the door. I went to my entrance and found the lockbox still mounted beside it. My key still worked, at least. Inside, the unit had been cleaned between guests in a generic way that made it feel like a hotel room rather than my home. Someone had removed the framed needlepoint my mother had made from the hallway and placed it in the closet, presumably because it wasn't photogenic. My reading chair had been pushed against the wall to make room for an arrangement that photographed better. There were small shampoo bottles in my shower that I'd never bought. I sat at my own kitchen table and breathed through it. The confrontation didn't happen that day. I needed to understand the full picture first. I called my attorney, a practical woman named Barbara who'd helped me draft the trust years ago. I pulled out the deed. I printed the rental listings, captured the reviews with dates and guest counts, and cross-referenced them with the calendar I kept of my own absences over the past year. Because it turned out this hadn't been only while I was in Phoenix. Weekends I'd spent at my college friend's cabin in the mountains, a 5-day trip to see my cousin in North Carolina last fall, even 4 days around Thanksgiving, when I'd stayed with Nathan upstairs while my unit was, supposedly, being painted. Someone had been generating income from my home for the better part of 7 months. When I had everything organized in a folder, I went upstairs and knocked. Renee answered in the kind of put-together way that tells you someone saw you coming. She had changed out of what she'd been wearing at the window. She offered me coffee, which I declined. I sat at their kitchen table and laid the folder in front of me but didn't open it yet. I said I needed her to explain the rental listings on my unit. She said she'd assumed I wouldn't mind, since it was sitting empty. I said it had been my primary residence for over 20 years, and I still lived there. She said I was gone a lot. I said my being gone did not alter the ownership of the property. She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're deciding how direct to be. Then she said, "Dorothy, Nathan told me this property would eventually come to him. We're just being practical about managing it in the meantime. That's not unreasonable." I asked what, exactly, Nathan had told her. She said he'd told her the building had been in the family, and that when the time came, it would be his. I said the building was in my name, and would remain so until I decided otherwise. She sat back in her chair. The friendliness left her face in a clean, businesslike way. "You've kept this over his head for years," she said. "He's 35 years old and he can't even have a real conversation about his own future because everything circles back to what you'll allow. That's not generosity. That's control." She folded her hands on the table. "I've spoken to a real estate attorney. There are things worth exploring here." I said I'd be happy to speak to her attorney together. With my deed, my trust documents, and the rental history I'd compiled from her own listings. Her jaw moved slightly. Then she said, I should leave their home. I said I was in the shared stairwell of my building, and I would leave when I chose to. She picked up her phone. 20 minutes later, 2 officers from the county sheriff's department were standing in the driveway. Renee had called to report a disturbance, a family member who was refusing to leave and becoming aggressive. One of the officers, a woman who introduced herself as Deputy Torres, asked me calmly if I was a resident. I said yes. I said I owned the building. I handed her the folder. Nathan had come downstairs by then and was standing slightly behind Renee with the look of a man watching something he'd set in motion from a great distance finally arrive. Deputy Torres took her time with the documents. Her partner knocked on Patty's door, and Patty, God bless her, came out in her good slippers and told them she'd known me for 17 years and that I'd lived in the lower unit the entire time she'd been in the neighborhood. Deputy Torres came back and stood between me and Renee. She said the deed and trust were in my name, that I appeared to be the legal owner of record, and that the rental account would need to be addressed separately, but that I had every right to be on my own property. She looked at Renee. She said, "You may want to speak with an attorney about the rental income, ma'am. Collecting revenue on property you don't own is something a district attorney tends to find interesting." Renee said, very quietly, "Nathan told me it was ours." Nathan looked at the ground. That was the moment I understood how much he had let her believe, not by accident, not by omission, but because a woman who thought she was building a life on solid ground stayed. A woman who knew she was living in someone else's house might not. The officers didn't make her leave that night. There was no court order yet, no formal process in motion, but something had cracked that couldn't be sealed back over. Renee went upstairs and closed the door, and Nathan followed, and I went into my own unit and sat in the reading chair. I'd pushed back to its proper place and stayed there until it was dark. He came down after midnight, knocked softly the way he had as a child. I let him in. He sat at the table and didn't make excuses right away, which I appreciated. He sat there for a while in the silence that had always been our version of honesty. Then he said he had told Renee the building would be his someday. He said she had interpreted that in a way that suited her, and he hadn't corrected it because it was easier to let her feel secure. I asked him if her feeling secure had been worth 7 months of my home being rented to strangers. He said no. I asked him if it had been worth the lockbox on my door. He said no again. I asked him what he had done with the money. He said Renee had handled it. He said he had seen the deposits go into an account he didn't have full access to. He said the number he thought had been going into their joint account didn't match what Barbara later helped me calculate from the listing records. The full picture took another 2 weeks to assemble. Renee had opened a separate account in her maiden name. Over 7 months, a little over $19,000 had been collected from guests staying in my home. Of that, Nathan had seen perhaps a third. The rest had been absorbed into accounts I had no visibility into, and he had never questioned. Barbara sent a letter. Renee had her own attorney respond, initially with language about marital assets and domestic arrangements, the kind of response that sounds authoritative until someone who actually knows property law reads it. Barbara called it decorative. We proceeded with a formal eviction notice for Renee specifically, as Nathan remained my tenant in good standing. My attorney also sent a separate communication to the district attorney's office regarding the rental income. Renee left on a Saturday. She didn't go quietly. She told Nathan on her way out that I had manipulated him his entire life, that I had kept him tethered to me through the illusion of generosity, that he would never build anything real as long as he was living in the shadow of his mother's charity. She said it loudly enough that I could hear parts of it through the floor. Nathan didn't answer. Or if he did, I couldn't make out what he said. The door to the upper unit closed. Her car reversed out of the driveway, and then there was the particular quiet of an empty space where something loud had been. I didn't go upstairs that night. I gave him time, the way I'd always tried to give him time. Though I'd learned over the years that too much of it becomes a different kind of abandonment. In the morning, I made enough coffee for 2 and left his mug on the counter. He came down around 9. He looked like someone who had been up most of the night, which he probably had. He sat across from me and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the backyard where Renee's teak furniture was still arranged in its curated configuration. He said he was sorry. Not a quick sorry, not the kind that moves the conversation forward. A sorry that sat there and weighted the air, the kind that means I see it now and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I asked him what he saw. He said he had let her build her confidence on something that didn't belong to her because her confidence made him feel like less of a failure. He said she had walked into his life at the moment when he felt most behind, when every person he knew seemed to have something to show for their years, and he had a declining freelance account and a borrowed apartment. And she had looked at him like he was a man with assets, a man with a future written in square footage and rental income and family property. He had let that look sustain him long past the point when he should have told her the truth. I said I understood the appeal of being seen a certain way. I said I had done my own version of it after Gerald died, telling people I was fine long after fine had stopped being accurate. He gave a short exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. Then he said he'd been afraid that if he told her the truth, she would leave. I said she had left anyway. He nodded slowly. He said yes, she had. We sat there for a while longer. Then he said he'd been thinking about calling someone. A therapist. Maybe. The kind he could talk to about why he'd made the choices he'd made. Not Renee specifically, but the pattern she had fit into. The years of feeling behind and the shortcuts he'd taken to feel less so? I said that sounded like a good idea. I said it was probably a better idea than most things he'd done in the past 18 months, which made him give another exhale, this one closer to something genuine. The teak furniture sat in the backyard for another 10 days before he began disassembling it and stacking it by the curb. Renee had paid for it, and she hadn't taken it, and neither of us wanted it. A young couple from 2 streets over took the sectional on a Tuesday morning and seemed genuinely delighted, which felt like the most cheerful thing that had happened in weeks. We put my bench back in the corner where it had always been. The legal process moved at its own pace, which is to say slowly and without drama. Renee's attorney made 2 more attempts to argue marital property rights, both of which Barbara disposed of efficiently. The district attorney's office opened an inquiry into the rental income. Renee, through her attorney, agreed to repay the full amount documented in exchange for the DA not pursuing charges. The money arrived in 4 installments over 6 months. I put it into a savings account I didn't touch. Nathan started therapy in July. He mentioned it the same way he used to mention doctor's appointments when he was young, briefly and without elaboration, but I could see the difference it was making in how he held himself. He reconnected with people he'd drifted from during his marriage. A friend from graduate school, a former colleague, his cousin in Ohio whom he hadn't spoken to in 2 years because Renee had found him tedious. He picked up a design contract with a local firm, then a second one. He started running again in the mornings. I heard him some days through the ceiling, moving around upstairs with a purposeful sound rather than the careful quiet of someone waiting to be told what to do. One evening in early fall, he came down while I was cooking and stood in the kitchen doorway in a way that reminded me of when he was 12 and wanted to ask something, but wasn't sure how it would land. I asked him what was on his mind. He said he wanted to stay in the upper unit, but he wanted to pay rent. Not as a favor returned or a guilt paid down, just as the fair thing to do. I told him we could talk about a number that made sense for both of us. He said he'd been thinking about the building differently lately, not as something that would come to him someday, but as something I had built and maintained and protected, and that being allowed to live in it was a gift he hadn't earned and had too easily mistaken for an entitlement. I turned off the burner and looked at him for a moment. He was still the boy who'd grown up in that building, who'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway and carved his initials into the garage door at age 7, which I'd pretended not to notice. And he was also a man who had made serious choices and was trying to understand why he'd made them, which is harder work than most people give it credit for. I said he had been allowed to live there because I loved him, and that was still true. He said he knew that now in a way he hadn't before. I put the burner back on and told him to set the table. I replaced the lockbox on my doorframe with a coat of fresh paint, the same sage green I'd chosen when Gerald and I first moved into the lower unit. I hung my mother's needlepoint back in the hallway. I moved my reading chair back to the window where it caught the afternoon light the way it always had. I called Patty and took her to lunch at the diner on Carmichael Street where we'd been going since our kids were in school together. And I told her the whole story, and she sat across from me with her hands wrapped around her coffee and said, "Oh, Dorothy," in the particular way she had of meaning both "I'm sorry" and "I told you so" without committing to either. Nathan filed for divorce in November. He didn't ask me to be involved, and I wasn't, except to make sure Barbara had reviewed the asset disclosures. The building, clearly titled in my name with documentation that left no room for interpretation, was not in dispute. Renee's attorney didn't even try. The morning the divorce was finalized, Nathan knocked on my door before I was fully awake. He was already dressed. He had coffee in a travel mug. He said he just wanted to say that he'd made his call, meaning his therapist, meaning he'd made the appointment months ago, but he was still making the call every week, still showing up. He said it still felt harder than he'd expected and quieter than he thought it would be. I said that was usually how the useful things felt. He nodded. He went back upstairs. I heard him leave for a morning run a few minutes later. The oak trees on the block had grown into each other overhead now, the way they always did by October, making a tunnel of yellow and rust over the street. I stood on the porch with my own coffee and looked at the building the way I sometimes did when I wanted to remember what it had taken to keep it. 3 decades of mortgage payments, 2 roof replacements, a full plumbing overhaul the year Nathan was in middle school, and the ongoing, unquantifiable work of making a place feel like somewhere worth coming back to. Gerald had said once, early on, that a house is just studs and drywall until somebody makes it mean something. We had made it mean something together, and when he was gone, I had kept making it mean something on my own, because that was what you did, and because the alternative was to let it become just a building on a street, interchangeable with every other one. It was still mine. The deed said so. 31 years of decisions said so, and on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, with the coffee warm in my hands and the leaves coming down the way they did every year, that was enough.